Hello, my name is Kathy Barnard. I'm the chairman of the Wolfeboro Planning Board. I'm here with Tavis Austin, who is the planning director for the town. The reason that we're here to talk to you is to discuss the proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance, which you will see on the warrant article when you vote at town meeting on March 14th. On the ballot this year, there are nine proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance. Each year, the Planning Board reviews the master plan and zoning ordinance to determine if changes are needed. Many times, the changes are needed just to make the ordinance easier to understand. This year, the Planning Board decided to focus on housing issues, and this is due to the critical need for housing in Wolfeboro and the surrounding areas. Many of the changes that we're proposing are simply rewriting the regulations to make them clearer. In some cases, we have simply moved them from one section to another, again, to make them clearer for people when reading them. So the first article is Article 2, Accessory dwelling units. This is the ability for people to add an extra dwelling unit if they meet certain regulations. This ordinance was first adopted by the Planning Board in 2017 in order to comply with a state statute passed by the state legislature. It allowed ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, one per property in all properties that allow a residence. Presently, we only allow attached ADUs. This amendment allows all attached ADUs by simply obtaining a building permit. In addition, the proposal allows detached ADUs, but a conditional use permit is required, which means a public hearing could be held. Tavis will now go through the details of the regulation.
Thank you. Without going through all of the lines of text, and just to start out, there is a voter's guide that's available to you. It's on the town website, and I have copies in the planning office if you'd like to see the changes. I'm also more than willing to sit down with folks who are interested and show existing ordinance versus proposed ordinance so you can see the changes. As Kathy identified, Article 2 essentially converts the existing accessory dwelling unit ordinance and proposes one that allows the attached or within an existing home to be permitted with a building permit only. The amendment also adds to the ordinance an option for detached accessory dwelling units with a conditional use permit. So that's a public hearing with a butter notification and the planning board evaluating the conditions. There are specific criteria, whether it's a new structure being constructed or an existing structure being converted. One of the things I think it's key for the public to understand is that all of the criteria and conditions of the accessory dwelling unit apply to both, whether it's accessory or interior. One of the units has to be owner occupied. It can't be used for a short-term rental or rented for a period of less than a month. It requires an additional parking space. All of the conditions that currently apply to ADUs also apply to the detached. One of the other elements that was important to the planning board was that the accessory structure appear accessory, i.e. incidental and subordinate to the primary structure. So they put a distance limit. It ranges now between, the detached would have to be between 50 and 100 feet. That's so you're not creating something that looks like two single-family homes on a lot. I think it's also important to point out that the town adopted, as Kathy said, following state statute in 2017, the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Only 4 accessory dwelling units have been built in town since 2017. 4 people have come in for a conditional use permit. So the planning board is providing this opportunity for a detached as an option, an opportunity for someone that may want an ADU but not want an attached ADU. It is not anticipated that the town will become overrun, at least given the current rate of interest expressed by applicants for accessory dwelling units.
Okay, Article 3, this is called Inclusionary Zoning. Again, it's about housing issues. It was first adopted by the Planning Board in 2009. That ordinance has not been used since 2009, and so we figured that we needed to look at it and make it a little more understandable. The ordinance does not affect the shorefront or the municipal watershed zone, and this is basically a rewrite of the zoning ordinance to clarify some of the requirements. It's a bonus ordinance to allow more units if the developer makes them affordable. It will also be allowed for subdivisions and multifamily dwellings, and a public hearing would again be needed. Okay, I'll turn this over to Tavis.
So again, the inclusionary ordinance is looking at and it's originally intended to be an encouragement for affordable housing. Affordable housing is defined by the state. Affordable housing does not mean Section 8 housing, if you will, or federally funded. It just means below market rate. It is a increase in housing opportunities, or creates an increase in housing opportunities by providing an incentive to developers to include affordable units. The original ordinance was primarily targeted at elderly housing. Recent statute change says that any ordinance that provides an incentive for elderly housing must extend the same rights, if you will, to all forms of housing, and that's what this rewrite does. Other elements are moving some of the terms or definitions, if you will, from the inclusionary zoning section to the definition section of the ordinance.
Do you mind just explaining a little more what the yield plan is that they talk about in this ordinance?
Yes. The yield plan is, okay, first let's talk about density. Every zone or every zoning district has a permitted density, 2 units per acre, 6 units per acre. Those are really the two main criteria. That's not as simple to say I have 10 acres, therefore I get 20 units if my density is 2 units per acre. A yield plan looks at the actual buildable area of the site. So things such as steep slopes, wetlands, areas of the land you couldn't develop otherwise are removed from the gross acreage. So once you come down to the net buildable acreage, that is what the multiplier is against density. So in most cases, it's close to a third of a gross parcel area that becomes restricted. So in that case, let's say once you determine your net area, you multiply it by the acreage, and that would yield you 4 units. With the inclusionary, if one of those units, so 4 times 0.15 rounds to 1, the inclusionary would allow 1 additional unit in that scenario. So it's not a density bonus as much as it is a housing allowance.
Okay, thank you
Sure.
for that. And again, these two ordinances are both related to housing, but they do not increase the density of housing in any way. It's still the same as it is today. The next few articles are in the definition section of the zoning ordinance, and the first one is a definition of boathouse. This is only a change of definition, and it's the definition used by the state. And Tavis will go through the details.
Yeah, not too much more to say about that particular one. There's an existing definition of boathouse. It's an older definition. The planning board looked at it, and it actually includes more structures than the board felt were originally intended by the original ordinance. So with the heightened sensitivity to shorefront impacts and things of that nature, the board recommended that the town definition of boathouse match that of the state, so that there was some consistency between state and local permitting for boathouses.
Okay, Article 5 is another definition, and this is a definition of short-term rentals. And Tavis, if you could go through the details on that one.
Sure. Much of early 2022 was spent with the Planning Board's subcommittee, the Short-Term Rental Committee, and there was much ado about what people were calling short-term rentals. Generically, people often refer to them as Airbnb or VRBO. I think it's critical that we, particularly as a board, but as a community, not pick a particular brand of the use, but identify what the use is. There was a lot of talk about whether Wolfeboro should follow on the heels of Conway and its efforts to curtail short-term rentals. And there was some healthy discussion at the Short-Term Rental Committee that ultimately looked to the zoning board to say, well, perhaps as a first step, the town needs a definition of short-term rental. For the record, there is currently no regulation in town that regulates how long somebody lives in a single-family home. If it's an approved single-family home, it doesn't matter if you're there a day or 2 days or 65 years. It's a single-family home. So the first step that the planning board took was to define short-term rental. The proposed definition of short-term rental is the use of a residential housing unit for inhabitation or rental for periods of less than 1 month or 31 days, whichever is less. The planning board ultimately landed on this because many people don't want to sign a 1-year lease. Many people that are renting are looking for a month-to-month or something like that. It was not the planning board's objective to stop month-to-month rentals. Really, the idea was to identify the weekend rentals or the week-in, week-out rentals. So that is the origin of the definition. Now, to be clear, the first words in the definition are the use. So by defining short-term rental as a land use, in this case, there is the impact of short-term rentals, new short-term rentals not being permitted in town. That is simply because none of the zoning districts currently allow short-term rental as a permitted or special exception use in town. For all of you that just took a deep breath in, if you've been doing short-term rental at any time prior to the potential passage of this ordinance, nothing changes. Anyone that has been doing short-term rental or what now would be termed short-term rental is not affected by this change.
Okay, thank you. And again, that refers back to the accessory dwelling where we did say no short-term rentals. So
correct.
This further explains it.
And to go back to Article 2, in accessory dwelling unit, one of the uses, remember I explained that all of the criteria for attached or detached are the same. One of those criteria that's proposed states neither the single-family home nor the ADU shall be used as a short-term rental or rented or inhabited for periods of less than 1 month or 31 days, whichever is less. So the ADUs as proposed are covered with or without, if you will, the passage of the short-term rental ordinance or short-term rental definition.
Okay, the next article is another definition, and that's to define conditional or special use permits. A public hearing would be required in order to allow any neighboring properties an opportunity to speak on this particular issue.
Yes, Article 6, as mentioned, is simply the addition of a definition of conditional or special use permit to the definition section. Why is it 1, not 2? Well, conditional use permit and special use permit are functionally synonyms for each other in the statute. And similarly, they are both conditional use permits and special use permits are listed in the regulations. The existing zoning regulations. So the board felt it important to note that conditional use or special use permit, functionally the same thing, 2 titles for the same process as Kathy outlined with the public hearing.
Okay, thank you. Article 7 proposes removing from the zoning regulation the reference to C2 zones. There is no longer any C2 zones in town, and all of the uses that were previously proposed in C2 have been allocated to different zoning districts. Go ahead, Tavis, and explain this.
Sure. So people that have been in town a while and are perhaps familiar with previous zoning maps or zoning district maps will recall that there were many areas of C2 zoning in town. In the early 2000s, much of the C2 area became what is now the current Bay Street Limited Business District or the Wolfeboro Falls Limited Business District. Again, at that same, I believe it was 2004 era, there was a big change where all of the C2 zones were removed, or retitled, I should say, rezoned, if you will. One of those sections still shows as C2, or one of those parcels actually still shows on the zoning map as C2, but it is in fact an error on the existing zoning map. It became C1 back in 2004. And again, I think it's important to note that there's no loss of uses, because Kathy mentioned the permitted and special exception uses that were in the C2 parcel, in theory, if you will, have now moved into the Pine Hill Road Development District and other zoning districts. Let's keep in mind, this article, it reads as though a zone is leaving. It's really not. If you go to the beginning of the zoning ordinance, it speaks to the zoning district boundaries. You will find no district boundaries for C2. That's because it went away in 2004. However, if you go to the various sections where it details the general residential, the commercial business district, downtown C1, there's still a C2 that lists uses and special exception uses, but there is no zone. So this is literally a bookkeeping article, if you will, to remove a reference to something that no longer exists.
Okay, the next article, Article 8, this is on the Shorefront Residential District. The changes are to allow one additional attached ADU, which is really already allowed because of the state statute that was passed in 2017. It also changes the description of boathouses, and other changes are being included just for clarification. Okay.
So, once again, 2017 is a popular year. In 2017, with the state passage of the ADU legislation, the town updated almost all of the zoning ordinances to match. The shorefront residential was, for some reason, left out of that. So the first part of this article, as Kathy said, was to allow one single detached dwelling per lot with one accessory dwelling unit. That's the same accessory dwelling unit permission that goes with all lots currently. But recall, Article 2, detached accessory dwelling units are not permitted with this change. Kathy mentioned the boathouse change, or the boathouse permitting process. So many know that boathouses are not allowed on Lake Wentworth. They are currently allowed on Winnipesaukee. However, the way the ordinance is currently written requires the applicant to get a special use permit from the planning board. And special use permit, as we learned with an earlier article, is a public hearing where the board reviews certain criteria. The planning board really has no authority over those criteria once the state has issued a boathouse permit. The state functionally goes through the same process that the planning board would. So the planning board felt that there was no benefit to the public by requiring an applicant to receive the same approval twice, essentially. So it's removing the special use permit criteria. It's not removing the requirement to get a building permit. It's not removing the requirement for shorefront residential compliance. It's simply saying The state is the permitting authority for boathouses, as they are with docks and piers and on all such waterfront elements. The last piece, Kathy summarized as clarification language. There was a term, it is stormwater management plan in the shorefront residential district. Toward the fall of last year, the planning board updated the townwide stormwater regulations for those projects that require site plan review. The result of that site plan process is a stormwater management plan. So where the shorefront residential language required a stormwater management plan, there was a conflict because the planning board was not intending to require site plan for shorefront development. So this simply is a strike through on the word stormwater management. However, I do feel it important. It doesn't mean shorefront residential doesn't have to do stormwater management. They still have to come up with a plan. They still have to follow all of the criteria. This is not a lessening or weakening of the regulation. This is just removing a word conflict within the ordinance. In fact, the last part of the article speaks to how stormwater management systems must be verified. Current ordinance allows photo documentation that has proved troublesome and ineffective to date. So the last part of this change is to require on-site inspection by the town building inspector or on-site inspection by a licensed engineer to make sure that the stormwater is installed appropriately.
Okay, and just to go back to the boathouse, the Conservation Commission always has the opportunity to send their comments to the state.
Correct.
Before the state approves the boathouse. Okay, the next article, Article 9, this is another housing issue. It's for the multifamily dwellings. This is simply deleting the existing sections from the regulations and putting it in each zone where these are already allowed. In the 3 zones where they are allowed, 3 residential zones, village residential district, general residential, and residential zone, and in all commercial zones. We've also are proposing eliminating the requirement for 5 units, but you still must meet the density and all other zoning requirements. And again, this type of development would require an approval by the planning board.
Correct. So step 1, it's multifamily. Once something is multifamily, which is 3 or more units per structure, it becomes commercial. Once it becomes commercial, site plan review is required. So the planning board is required for anything that is multifamily in nature. There are existing regulations in the ordinance that speak to multifamily. This is moving them, as Kathy said, from one section of the ordinance for clarification purposes into each of the base zoning districts. The density does not change. Well, it actually goes down a little. It does not increase, is the key part. The 5 units per structure is something the planning board talked about. Some of the zones are held to 5 units per structure. If you're converting your house to multifamily, you're limited to 5. Or if you're in other zones, you're allowed to convert up to 6. The planning board had some brief discussion on it and could not understand why, if density would allow more units, why we would hold someone to 5 or 6 units. Functionally, what happens there, the house isn't getting bigger, the density isn't increasing, but if you go through the same process of how big is the lot, what's the allowed density, why would the town restrict the number of units in a structure if they could still satisfy parking and things of that nature? Keep in mind, if you're starting with a house that you can't make any bigger to convert and you're increasing the number of units, the units are simply getting smaller. By units getting smaller, that's increasing the opportunity for the inclusionary zoning, for affordable units, and more housing opportunities without adding more structures. Also, by reducing the limitation on number of units per structure, you're effectively decreasing the lot coverage when somebody starts with a new project. You may be creating bigger buildings, but you're creating fewer buildings, which keeps the construction cost down and allows the opportunity for development of more units in a more affordable nature, thereby more affordable housing.
Right, and again, this really is just a rewrite in putting the multifamily homes in districts where they are now allowed. So really there's no particular change.
Correct.
The Article 10, lots with no frontage, has been in the ordinance since 2014. This would require only a conditional use permit with the planning board.
Correct. For the number crunchers out there, there's a RSA 67441 that does not allow you to pull a building permit for a structure if your lot does not have frontage. That is frontage on a road. 67441 goes on to say that the town, through legislative process, can allow processes to accept lots from that ordinance or from that statute. That's what the planning board did originally. The original process, or the original adoption, included a special exception through the Zoning Board of Adjustment. The planning board looked at the current process, felt it was more appropriately coined a planning function than a judicial function, if you will. Looked at it as an opportunity to bolster inclusion of those back lots, in most cases, into the neighborhood in which they existed, and therefore came up with the change to a conditional use permit, which is permitted by statute. All of their criteria remain the same. If you have a legal lot or a lawfully created lot and you have a deeded right-of-way to it, you come to the planning board, you show evidence of that, address the conditional use permit criteria, and building permits can be issued. To that end, this process has only been used twice since the original adoption. It's also worth noting the original adoption also covered all island lots, for those of you that don't have any roads.
Right. Okay. All right. So that's really all we have to say about the zoning regulations. If you're interested and you want more information, all you have to do is get in touch with Tavis in the planning office, or you could go to the planning board section of the town website, and you'll see all of the complete zoning amendments laid out. I want to thank you for listening to these explanations, and to Community TV for broadcasting them. The planning board really feels that the housing ordinance changes are very important to the town. The housing shortage affects the town's economy. These proposals do not affect density, but we hope it will make it easier for people to provide more housing for the community. And please don't forget to vote on Tuesday, March 14th. And thank you.
Thank you.